Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one of the problems with this bill, and it's a problem with the Act that came into force under the last government, is that it gives the impression that victims are getting serious financial compensation. In fact, they're not, and it's just crumbs from the table for a few victims. And the real question of compensation, proper compensation for all victims of crime, is not addressed in this bill. And in fact, it is interesting, when the original bill came through under the Labor government and became an act, it was the victim support organisations that were amongst the harshest critics of the bill, because they saw that this would give some pretence that there was real compensation for victims when there isn't any universal scheme for providing appropriate financial compensation. There has been the development, and the police have done a good job in this, in developing victim support immediately after the crime, when people have suffered badly and psychological trauma. And there's a great volunteer system across the country of people who give freely their time to help the police to be with the victims at their time of greatest trauma. But when you get to the follow-up system and proper financial compensation to put people back on the road to compensate for what they've suffered, it isn't really there. And in fact, there's a perversity, as has been commented before, in the legislation, that the crumbs from the table that some victims might get, or they almost have a vested interest in criminals in jail being beaten up and then making a compensation claim, and then they'll get a little bit of it themselves. It's a twisted logic way of getting compensation as a victim of crime. And the whole concept of punishment is distorted by this bill. When people commit crimes, they're sentenced to punishment, a term in prison. That is the punishment, the term in prison. They aren't sentenced to be having other things done to them, being beaten up or anything like that. And there is a concept almost behind this bill that, perhaps they deserve a bit of beating up, a bit of punishment, because if they are, it's not going to be rewarded so much in terms of any compensation. There's the concept that they are lesser beings, in fact, with lesser rights. And that is a very bad sort of concept. It eats away at our ethics, because the root of all prejudice is defining a category of people as lesser, perhaps subject to mistreatment, subject to beating. In the extreme, of course, you have these fratricidal conflicts and ethnic conflicts where people beat up and kill each other because they treat the other lot as lesser beings. And prejudice in this society towards prisoners, and Tariana Turia mentioned it in her very good speech, towards prisoners, and then that carries over to prejudice against other races, particularly races that are perhaps more highly represented in the prison population. So this bill, by treating prisoners as lesser beings with lesser rights or having lesser right to compensation, is actually feeding that stereotyping of people in a negative way, and it can't be tolerated, and that's why the Green Party is voting against this bill.